Welcome to another enlightening discussion where we explore the ever-evolving world of risk management and refine our Presilience approach, a concept that you're going to hear coming up in the next little while as we spend our time together, as we approach and our approach to navigating challenges. My name is Dave Cohen and I am your host for this episode. On Sunday evening in Brisbane, an attempted stabbing occurred in a local grocery store, something unfortunately that we are all too familiar with. Remarkably, one of the world's foremost experts in risk and occupational violence was on site during the incidents. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Joining me today is none other than Dr. Gav Schneider, who is the CEO of the Risk to Solution group of companies and a global authority on occupational violence and aggression. Gav is a lifelong martial artist holding master's grades in several systems, including an 8th Dan in Krav Maga or an 8th degree in Krav Maga. He's been recognized as one of the world's greatest martial artists by the Martial Arts Masters Association and is a 4-time IFSEC global thought leader. Gav is also the author of 3 influential books, including the highly regarded Can I See Your Hands and the highly anticipated upcoming release of Presilience, which is due out in April 2025. Notably, he is the first person in Africa to have completed a PhD in criminology with a specialization in security risk management. Gav has conducted business in over 17 countries around the world, from presidential executive protection to training tens of thousands of individuals worldwide. I'm sure that you will all agree that it's safe to say that we have a subject matter expert on our hands here, and you are more than qualified, Gav, to share your insights with us. In this discussion, we'll unpack what happened during the incident, Gav's immediate observations, and most importantly, what are the practical takeaways for individuals and organizations to stay safer? And what is that duty of care that organizations need to be imparting on their teams to make sure that they are presilient in their approach? Now, what is Presilience? What does this all mean? Let's have a look. Now, Presilience is a concept that Gav created as well in about 2017, and it builds on the foundations of compliance, resilience, moving to a state of proactive prevention and opportunity centricity. It's essentially a toolbox for proactively managing risks. For those unfamiliar with the concept, I like to think of it as a Swiss Army knife because there's really a tool there for every type of situation. So let's dive into this fascinating discussion and uncover what we can learn from Gav's first-hand experience on Sunday evening. Gav, welcome to the episode and really a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Dave. Very happy to be chatting about this. And as per your introduction, we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous digital world. We've been talking for so long about, post-COVID, how people's ability to self-regulate, manage themselves, and avoid violence has changed, and that there's so much, frustration, aggression, which does manifest in violence out there. So it was really interesting to walk right into that again on a Sunday evening when, to be honest, I was least expecting it. And it's interesting to note that, after 20 or 30 years of a lot of frontline stress, responding to situations that were dangerous and being exposed to dangerous situations, I'm glad a lot of it is muscle memory, but not all of it is. And it's important for us to remember that it's not easy to respond effectively in a stressful situation. So happy to start off wherever you'd like, Dave.
Gav, let's start at the very beginning. Take us through exactly what happened. Now, as I understand it, you had just been to the gym, you were zen, you were relaxed, you were calmed. It was Sunday afternoon. You got the fateful phone call on your way home. Honey, please can you stop past the grocery store and just pick up a few things? What happened next?
So, Dave, it's even better than that. For kind of mental health and recovery, I was encouraged a while ago to start floating, which is basically where you just concentrate, it's quiet, there's no noise. So I'd come out of that. So I was exceptionally relaxed. Okay? And my wife had called me and asked me just to pick something up from the grocery store on the way home. So as I stopped, This is now 5:15, 5:30 on a Sunday afternoon in sleepy Brisbane. I get out of the car, walking into the shopping centre, and something seemed off. And, while I've had extensive experience on the front lines, looking at everything from assaults to firearm incidents, it's been a good few years since I was directly involved with something of significant consequence that was fast evolving. So as I walked into the shopping area around the center, there were lots of people standing and watching something, which instantly kind of got my spidey sense going and straight away shifted me, for those who've been trained in some of our situational awareness methodology, from what was really a color white or yellow, where I was not effectively aware or alert, probably into a yellow or orange, where I was trying to understand what was happening. The next piece was, as I got closer, I first created a bit of safe separation for myself with some barriers to try and understand what was going on, noting those who studied our Presilience methodology know we like to draw a lot from hindsight, and also noting that there have been a few stabbings and attacks in grocery stores and shopping centres in Australia over the last little period. I didn't want to walk into something I wasn't prepared for. And obviously avoidance and prevention is our primary driver. So as I started getting closer, I saw a young lady, maybe probably early 20s, maybe late teens, standing in front of a man, threatening him with a knife, screaming at him that if you come close, I'm going to cut you. So my initial observation was he was unarmed. She was armed. She was in a highly distressed state. Okay, there might have also potentially on her side been some mental health issues, just based on how she was dressed and conducting herself. There was really very little scene control and no response. My first response was to look around at everybody and go, who has called 000? Which is kind of scary, that I've walked into a situation that had clearly been going on for a while and nobody had thought to call 000 yet, which is kind of scary. I then saw, and this is a very worrying piece, staff in a grocery store are not trained to deal with this level of conflict, nor to deal with this level of escalation. And you could see it clearly. They were lost. They didn't know what to do. But a bystander and one of the staff members seemed to have understood that if they have a bit of distance, they could talk, and eventually got this girl to agree that if she would put the knife down if the guy left. The guy started leaving, and she was seeming to de-escalate. And in a situation like this, de-escalation is really what you want. After a lifetime of martial arts training, anybody who's been in a knife fight or taught knife fighting will tell you that people get cut, and people get cut with their own blades, or innocent people get cut. And from my perspective, this was not at the point where it was life-threatening that somebody had to rush in and take this girl down, because she was clearly triggered. As the person who was triggering her left, she seemed to de-escalate, but then he turned around like he was coming back and she ran at him. I had several barriers between me and them, and a bystander actually ran up, never managed to chat to the guy, and did an armbar takedown on her, which is actually the right technical move to do. Instantly there, this is where reflex comes in. There's a little bit of a blur, but I ran in, helped to get the knife away once he had her on the ground, and saw that he had been cut. And thank God, not a fatal cut, but certainly a cut across the top of his fingers, which was definitely going to require stitches, maybe surgery. At the same time, everyone's trying to control this girl, and her mother came in and actually sat on her. So for me, and this is an important piece for any first responder, at this stage, it's all about situational control. So at that stage, we were able to verify somebody had called the police, which is great. They weren't there yet. I was starting to worry about positional asphyxiation, which is what happens when somebody holds someone else down and they can't breathe. And equally, this girl's arm was bent to the point that it was almost breaking, and you could see that the people around her had lost any sort of empathy for her at all. And there's absolutely no reason that she would have had to break her arm to control her at that point. Shortly thereafter, the police arrived. I started providing first aid for the guy who was injured, who seemed fine and in a good state of mind. The person who had aggravated the girl came back and actually landed up. This was an interesting turning point and something worth considering. Walked up to this poor girl and slapped her while she was handcuffed on the ground. He was then arrested and she was arrested. which clearly indicates so much more to the story than we were able to see, probably domestic violence and abuse and a whole bunch of history there. So I think it's really important, and I'm happy to get into more of a discussion now around practicalities for prevention, response, and recovery with these sort of incidents. But our business runs violence prevention training as a speciality. Okay, we run aggression management and we run situational awareness, all of which form part of our Presilience packaging. So what's important to remember with this sort of thing is, what is the likely consequence? You spoke about risk management. Risk management talks about the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Most of the scenarios that have huge impact and consequence happen very quickly, where there's not enough time to do detailed risk assessments, factor in all the variables, and consider the possible outcomes. But I think there are many takeaways from this. I took a few myself around my own personal readiness and the fact that Australia has changed. We grew up in South Africa. We've been used to crime and violence. There's certainly a change if we look at the statistics being reported to us through our clients who we're providing this sort of training for. And now, without question, looking at the direct observation, we've really seen this increase where people are acting out violently, carrying weapons more and more, and this is happening in public. So if we start looking at these sort of things, the impact of these acts of violence, acts of crime, which, in the modern world are very blurry. Some are ideologically motivated. This one looked like it was historically motivated based on domestic violence, trauma, and abuse. Yeah, the reality is we need a little bit of a wake up in Australia. And this is not uncommon in many parts of the world. In South Africa, as you know, we had trained thousands and thousands of people in situational awareness and personal safety. In the US, there's equal requirements for this sort of thing, but it's slightly different based on many of those states being gun cultures and having a different structure there. So realistically, what can we take away from this? Let's have a good chat. I'm happy to answer any questions you want now that we've covered the scenario.
That's a great segue, Gavin. Thanks for that. Now, just while you're talking, I'm unpacking the tools that are coming out of Presilience. And one of the tools that you really, we love labels. We like to label things and to say, right, what is the right tool for this particular job? And you mentioned the Cooper's color code system. You mentioned the OODA loop there, how you successfully actually didn't title it, but you observed, orientated, decided, and then took action based on what you had seen. So these kinds of things are instinctive to you because of your background and because of the things that you've done. But potentially our audience and those people listening to this episode aren't aware of that strategic system. And you spoke about situational awareness and how important that situational awareness aspect is to it. Now, you touched on it there. Now, I want to deep dive into that aspect of it. So now we've got the picture. Now, that picture is a clear illustration. And to your point, I think it's important to understand that bad things are going to happen. Wherever we are in the world, whatever we're doing, bad things are going to happen, whether it's politically motivated, whether it's mental illness, whether it's a personal vendetta, whether it's a hit on your organization, whether it's an insider threat, bad things are going to happen. So we can't necessarily try and work out and be that, try and guess what that bad thing is going to be. We need to prepare ourselves for disruption. What are the things that are going to prevent me from carrying on with my day or reduce the impact that it's going to have on my day when bad things go wrong? So you mentioned, we spoke about OODA loop and color code, Cooper's color code and those sorts of things. Now, from your experience and based on the environment that you saw, before we get into solutions mode, let's first unpack. There were a group of people around. There were people that were sure, that were people that were unsure, that were those that wanted to just, use, and we've got to talk about appropriate use of force here. We've got to talk about this duty of care. Let's talk about the mental state that you witnessed firsthand of these people that were in the situation before we go into solutions mode. Was there really a problem, and is there really a need for us to be having this discussion?
Great question, Dave. And I really love where we've gone with this now, because what's so important with situations like this is not to be one-dimensional and to apply many of the tools we teach. Tactical is a great example. That's strategic and tactical integration. So when you come in on the ground, you're tactical. But for me, there's a key strategy driver here. My profile, my experience, my knowledge is slightly different to that of others. And I'm not a superhero. I'm nearly 50. And I've seen lots of bad things happen, and I know that
Please don't say that, Gav, because I'm just behind you, and that would make me nearly 52, and I'm not quite ready for that.
But Dave, to your point, what is interesting is that when you see people standing around, one of the questions we always have to ask, why? And we talk a lot about, David Grossman's sheepdog model and his idea, that we want to rely on the sheepdogs to protect us. There's a fundamental challenge. When these things happen, the real first responder are the people at the scene. We have to wait for our competent, trained responders. And I think this is also a good point to just give a shout out to the Queensland Police Service and the Queensland Ambulance Service. They handled the scene incredibly well when they arrived and did a really, really good job of getting control of that. And it's wonderful to see authorities deal with these things effectively. The challenge is the before that and the after that. So in the before phase, okay, practically, when you look at an incident like this, there's got to be considerations. And if you're listening to this webinar, I'd ask you, or podcast, I'd ask you to be thinking about what do you want out of that situation. So one of the smartest things to do would have been if I'd arrived at the grocery store and I saw a violent situation happening, leave, right? And call the police on your way out, because your personal safety is really important. So that was really interesting for me to see how many people were standing around. There's some of them relatively close, where there's clearly an unstable situation going on, and there could have been personal damage done to others. So equally, based on this not being an active arm offender, being a focused event, people standing around didn't have a significant consequence. Had this been an active arm offender event where this person was stabbing other people, not just focused on one, that is a terrible response. People should be responding. So in Australia, we use an escape, hide, tell model, which is get out of there. If you can't get out of there, hide and inform the authorities and communicate. In the US, run, hide, fight. But practically, those are autonomic and instantaneous responses to threat. That should have come into place straight away. Didn't really see that happen. So first big takeaway is it doesn't really matter who you are. Learn how to be situationally aware and come up with plans that you can implement in worst case and violent scenarios. I didn't see any of the other stores around shutting down or going into any lockdown processes. Having said that, this threat might not have been big enough for that, but you'd love to think that they'd have the ability to do that should something violent like this ensue.
Now, taking into consideration, I have to ask the question, how many mobile phones were out? Because the social media courts are imminent, and that story probably hit the social media platforms immediately, is that we've got that bystander effect that everyone stands around and looks at what's going on and doesn't really jump in to effectively even use your mobile device to phone someone rather than to turn it on to camera mode.
To your point, there were plenty. And equally, I have to say that factored in significantly to my thinking. So for me, there was a response line that I've been well trained to identify. And that response line was how many other innocent people were going to get hurt out of this. And if that was going to happen before the police could get there, then that requires a response from someone like me. If no one else is going to get hurt, it's better to wait for the authorities and let the competent people whose job it is deal with this. Okay, so practically, there were lots of people filming, and some of them were close enough to probably get stabbed. Okay, and that had a significant overlay also in my own thinking. And I would urge anybody with a hero mindset, full credit to the guy who ran in and took her down. But practically, I do think that situation might have been one that was de-escalatable. Okay? But realistically, as soon as you confront somebody with a knife, you should be ready to get stabbed. And I'm not sure what his decision-making criteria was, but I've been doing martial arts for 40 years. There were plenty of options to take down an armed assailant, but most of them probably would have left her pretty hurt. And that was probably the decision-making factor on my side, going, this seems to be a girl in distress. And so if I had to take her down, break her arm, kick her in the knee, etc., I've just done something worse to somebody in distress. So what's important there is that segue, and you mentioned OODA loop situational awareness, but that's the adrenal response management componentry. The ability to try and make sure you can keep yourself at a state where you can perform and make good decisions. If I look at my younger self, I probably would have run in there straight away and tackled her or done something which might have seen me get hurt or her get hurt and not got us a good outcome. So lots of variables to that too, Dave.
So as we just close off the actual particular incident and start going into solutions mode for individuals and organizations, you mentioned, then we spoke about it a little bit earlier as well, that duty of care. Just because someone has a knife, we don't know why she has a knife. We don't know what the situation is. We don't know what's provoked the situation. We can't just pull out a handgun and shoot her in the head, right? Or go in with 10 people jumping on top of her and asphyxiating her. There's still that element of duty of care that we have an appropriate force to make sure that, we've disarmed the situation. The situation is no longer, and the chap that came in and took a liberty and smacked her across the head once she was in cuffs, the threat was neutralized. There was no longer a threat. So we've just got to be mindful of those sorts of things as well. And to your response, if we go back to Cooper's color code, really understand where we're at. So we talk about situational awareness, but equally that self-awareness piece is just as important in a situation like that, to understand our state of mind, which would then influence our actions either at the moment, whether you get a chance to get into your car and drive home and spend your Sunday evening with your family, or you'll be spending it at the police station answering questions for your behavior. But let's move on to the next part of this discussion, which is now the proactive part. So now this has happened in a grocery store on a Sunday evening, but it could quite easily have happened in the basement of a parking lot in an office. It could have quite easily have happened in the office, and it didn't have to be with a knife. It could be with a stapler. It could be verbal. It could be anything like that, right? So occupational violence and aggression is a thing. It's a big thing. And it's raising its head in a really, really nasty way. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of hours online where individuals can go and get material and study OVA and study situational awareness and do these online courses. But we've found in our history, and you can just comment on this as well, you've got a far more extensive history on this, is that it's not really practical, right? We tick the box and we get to do the compliance bit to say that it's been done. Let's talk practicalities here, right? Let's move on to organizations. What should organizations be looking at to better equip their staff? Now, we talk about also the whole of person model, right? So gone are the days when we get to work in the morning, we leave home at the front door, or when we get home, we leave work at the front door. And then we've got the added complexity of a digitalized world or a virtual world that we're living in. These are all integrated. So when we're training for work, we're not only training for work, we're training for Sunday afternoons at the grocery store as well, and our behavior online. So from an organizational perspective, where do you think this duty of care lies, and what do you think is practical for organizations to be looking at?
Great, Dave. Let's use the compliance, resilience, presilience framework to explore that. And equally, I think it's really important for us to accept the reality that duty of care is a very tough area that constantly evolves. So let's start with the beginning, right? Duty of care, we have significant duty of care legislation in Australia, and there's many first world countries that have similar type structures. But realistically, that duty of care extends to the owner-operator of a site or facility and requires them to ensure a safe operating environment for their staff or other people attending that site. So if you look at that as the first piece, yes, unforeseen things can happen anywhere. If I was the expert called in as an expert witness in that case, I would say that that specific store failed in their duty of care. Not that the staff didn't want to help, because I had people running and scurrying to get first aid boxes and kits, but they were not trained in basic first aid. They were not trained in incident management. They were not trained in effective comms, and they certainly weren't trained in de-escalation. Now, you might ask the question of, is that a requirement for a grocery store? But if we look at the risk management process and go, these incidents are happening. We saw a major grocery store chain in Australia just ban knives, which practically is risk theatre at its best, because in this scenario, the person brought their own knife in. So realistically, that doesn't solve the problem in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, let's just identify for our listeners, risk theatre. What is that?
Well, that's where we implement risk measures that make us feel better, but don't actually solve the problem in any way, shape, or form. It creates the perception that we're managing risk, but we don't really solve the problem. And back to your point, let's look at the compliance piece. Most businesses look at the cheapest conceivable way to address their duty of care. Responsible businesses would look at what's effective, not just how do we address the duty of care in the cheapest way. So if we look at what kind of happens here, and I think this is a fair assessment, I'm an experienced professional who's been doing this for a long time, and I would think twice now about the way I'd go back to that store. And I'd also think twice about when I go back to that store with my kids. So practically for us, we need to look at this bigger picture. And we need to be able to understand we have to move past compliance. If we look at the resilience piece, there's no question there was a lot of resilience, because after the incident, I was able to buy the groceries I had, walk out and come home. And the store still functioned, and I was able to pay for the products despite this relatively minor interruption. Okay, so from a resilience perspective, that's great to see. And post-COVID and post many of these things, it's nice to see that people can keep going. But practically, resilience is just not enough. Okay, so if I look at incidents like that, and we start taking the presilience piece, which looks at two things: proactive prevention and opportunity-centrism. The ability for a shopping center or for a grocery store to be able to proactively prevent any of its patrons from resorting to violence is probably unrealistic. Okay, without effective access control, without terms and conditions about not bringing weapons in, etc., and the ability to enforce that, it's incredibly hard. Which means technically there should have been a risk process that said we can't do that. We cannot guarantee that people with ill intent won't enter our store, which now gets us into the other side of the Presilience equation, which is what have we learned and how do we do that differently? And if I was running that grocery store, I'd be thinking very, very carefully about how do I teach my people to respond in that first 30 seconds? Because in that first 30 seconds, that incident could probably have been de-escalated and avoided altogether. I wasn't there in the first 30 seconds, so I'm making an assumption. But practically, early on, all that needed to happen was those parties need to get separated, not visibly see each other, and then a process of trying to calm down the aggravated and aggressive party and understand what's happening could have ensued. None of that happened. Having said all of that, this might have exploded very quickly, where two people just walked into the grocery store and all of a sudden she pulled out the knife and it went crazy. So that part they've got CCTV, they should be doing a review, a lessons learned, an understanding of what actually happened, a review of the way their staff members performed. They should be looking at when the police were called. Was it quick enough? They should be looking at how they assisted the police. They should be looking at how first aid was provided. And they should be thinking about, let's take the compliance resilience model. What are the rules we now have to put in place? And I'll say this again, think of banning knives doesn't solve the problem. We need to be pragmatic and practical about solutions that work. So some of those things are cost prohibitive or difficult to do. I honestly believe that looking at your processes, policies, and procedures and having a clear system of response when things happen that are disruptive needs to be put in play. I can almost guarantee you that a mature grocery store would have had that. So what does that tell you? It tells you that people are not trained and do not understand what the organizational policies are there for and what they do. And this is not just a training problem. This is an understanding problem. It's a responsibility and accountability problem. So realistically, from a duty of care perspective, there's much that organizations can do. The challenge is it takes time, effort, and resources to do it. And I think this is the interesting piece. You made a very good observation, which is that we can't have a plan for every single scenario that happens. But we should, at the very least, have a scenario response for a low-level disruption, a disruption that has some violence with it, and a catastrophe or a major disaster. And we should have structures in place for before, during, and after. And if organizations don't know how to do that, that's not an excuse. There are lots of ways that we can plug in to get people to do it. So humble request, if you've listened to this, please reach out to Dave or go and do an internal review of what you do. We have to change the way we tackle these challenges. This is not a problem only for the government or only for the police. It's also not a problem only for retailers or businesses. It's a problem for all of us. And we all have to be part of the solution. So whether you're a bystander, whether you're the police, whether you're the business, we've got a joint responsibility to create a safe environment for us to exist. Let's start working together to figure out how to do this instead of shifting the blame continuously when bad things happen.
So, Gav, Absolutely incredible. And there's probably another 3 hours of content that we need to cover here, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But I echo the challenge that you put out there to organizations. You've probably got very, very sound policies and procedures that will pass any audit, but it's not a case of what to do in a situation and when to do it, but more effectively how. And I think the question that organizations can probably go back and ask themselves is, how well have we tested and exercised these policies and procedures that we've got implemented, that our staff feel empowered and our teams feel empowered to be able to act and carry out our policies and procedures effectively? And you used that word tactical earlier, and that really refers to that alignment of what those policies and procedures are and how well equipped the tactical operators in the front line are to carry them out. Gav, we are completely out of time. Thank you very much for your valuable time, for your insights, for your pragmatic views. And unfortunately, it's situations like adversity that bring us together to have these discussions, but hopefully these discussions can help proactively prevent bad things from happening in the future. Thank you all for your time, and thank you all for listening.